In the summer of 2003, I began filming the series Atheism, A Rough History of Disbelief. As part of the process, I talked to a number of writers, scientists, historians, and philosophers. Having secured their cooperation, I was very embarrassed to find that a large proportion of what went on ended up on the cutting room floor, simply because the series would have lasted 24 hours otherwise. Well, as it happens, the BBC agreed with me that the conversations were too interesting to be junked. And with these 6 supplementary programs, they've made the extremely unusual decision to go back to the original material and to broadcast at length some of the conversations which I had. Conversations with people such as the English biologist Richard Dawkins, the American philosopher Daniel Dennett, the Cambridge theologian Dennis Turner, the American playwright Arthur Miller, the English philosopher Colin McGinn, and the American Nobel Prize-winning physicist Steven Weinberg. One of the first people I talked to on making the series on atheism was the Cambridge theologian Dennis Turner, whose inaugural lecture on taking up the chair of theology was entitled How to Be an Atheist. Well, as it happens, the conversation we had was never included in the final series, since it turned out to be much more to do with the current relationship between theology and philosophy than it was about the history of disbelief. However, Professor Turner's theological arguments were so interesting and so forceful that I'm pleased now to have the opportunity to show them at their full length. Well, Dennis, I'm reluctant, as you'll see for reasons which we'll discuss, to use the word atheism of myself. I'm reluctant to call myself an atheist, but I get the impression from your inaugural lecture that you feel that us atheists, if I can use that term of ourselves, have somehow, A, missed the target, and also that from the title of your lecture, that atheism is an achievement of some sort, or it's something which one can get good at, and one can do it badly or achieve it badly. Now, I wonder if you could explain to me, first of all, why it is you feel that atheism is something which you have to practice, and practice makes perfect, and we've got it wrong.
Well, I think that you've got to find a way of avoiding a certain kind of question if you're going to be a proper card-carrying atheist. I think one begins to be a theist, to start at that end, when one realises that there's a certain kind of question which gets swept off the agenda. And my point was you have to work quite hard to ensure that question doesn't keep on re-emerging. And that question is the question, why is there anything at all? As distinct from, well, how are things given that we've got them? And I think it takes quite a lot of work, really, to be sure that your position is secure against that kind of question re-emerging, and I think it just does. Marx once said that each age asks only such questions as it can answer, and it's the cutting back on the agenda of questions which seems to me to be the important issue here. I mean, even more important than the question of whether God exists is the question of what questions are legitimate. And the standard answer to, I suppose, the theistic position in our time is that the question which the name God appears to be some sort of answer to doesn't make sense as a question, gets ruled out. So it's the agenda of questions which is where I would start. And why is it that that a culture limits itself to asking, as it were, a set of routine questions which it has handily the methodologies for answering? It's almost as if the methods we've got for answering questions dictate what questions we allow to be asked. And I just think that there's a very troubling question which kind of niggles on the edge of all the other questions.
Well, if we can get back to that bigger and more awkward question, but return for the moment to the card-carrying atheist.
Yeah.
I always get the impression that the card carriers, and there were more of them, as you say, once than there are now, is it not the case that the reason why there were so many explicit article-writing, card-carrying atheists who, as it were, affirmed their position and recruited people and so forth. People like Bradlaugh, for example, or Annie Besant, and John Stuart Mill, for for instance, that the reason why they were so explicitly card-carrying was that they were up against a formal institution which forbade there being a disbelief.
Sure. Sure. I mean, those were the days when it was intellectually interesting to be a card-carrying atheist. I think it ceased to be intellectually interesting, which is why I find the likes of a card-carrying atheist like Richard Dawkins to be really just an inverted image of a certain kind of rather narrowed-down theism. There's a sort of fundamentalism about Dawkins' atheism which matches, as in the reversing of a mirror image, that which he's rejected, and it seems to me there's a certain locking of that card-carrying atheist into a fixed form of theism which it opposes, which, if you like, also matches on the atheist side the refusal to ask certain sorts of questions on the theistic side. To give you a practical example, it seems to me that if you suppose that in this world there is a space which must be occupied by evolution, and that whatever space is occupied by evolution God has to be excluded from, then it doesn't really matter which way around you have it. If you're an evolutionary theorist, you're going to have to exclude God. If you're a theist of the same sort, then you're going to have to exclude evolution. And there's, as it were, an equivalent fundamentalism on either side, which is why I think much more troubling to a theist is the position of indifference than that of militant atheism. Well, your position as distinct from Dawkins, for example.
Now, I want to ask you then, why is it troubling to you that there should be people like myself for whom it's a matter of indifference, to whom, to speak for myself, the question really never occurred. It never entered my mind when I was a child. I heard people using this strange glottally stopped monosyllable and never knew what it was they were talking about.
I prefer a more intellectually exciting life than yours. I mean, I think everything does hang on the question of whether God exists or not. And I think that on the one hand, I'd like to re-educate some of the card-carrying atheists into what it is they should be denying, as distinct from what it is they do deny. On the other hand, it does seem to me that there are questions which remain to be asked, and I think challenging people to ask them, and asking them why it is that when presented with a question, why is there anything at all rather than nothing, they seem to rule it out as an intelligible or sensible question, or at any rate as a question which doesn't matter. It seems to me that it must matter, though in a rather peculiar sort of way. It's not going to make any difference to how you understand the world if the answer is there must be something which accounts for the fact that there is anything rather than nothing. It accounts for the existence of what there is, not for the kind of thing, kind of world that it is. And I think that as Wittgenstein said, it's not how the world is, but that it is, that is the cause of astonishment. And I think I'd just like to try and arouse people to a stronger sense of that astonishment, that there is anything at all. Well, there might not have been.
Well, you see, while I think there is something startling and remarkable about the fact that there is something, and that it never ceases to amaze, and to produce all the feelings which religious people of various denominations say, where do you get your spiritual feelings from? Now, whatever, I hate to use the word spiritual, but the feelings of awe or splendor, or what Freud referred to as oceanic feelings that I get, are as suddenly catching myself out and saying, it's amazing that A, that my consciousness exists, and that my consciousness has content at all. But where I find I differ from you, even in this attenuated, non-idolatrous form of theism, is that if you can ask the question, why is there anything at all, and the answer to that seems to be, there is something which accounts for it, then I find myself, well, why is there God then? Why does the question not go into a series of infinite regresses, asking the question about why the cause of it all, or the bringer about of it all, does not itself, himself or herself, require some sort of
But now you see, you and I are engaged in an argument. I mean, we could have a discussion about that, and a very complex and detailed discussion about it. And it just seems to me that that's where I would want to start, with a sense that there is a problem here. And that there is a problem here at least moves one away from that condition of absolute intellectual indifference to the question of God. There is a fight on now, and it seems to me we're back, as it were, in the days where it mattered what answer one gave to that.
Well,
I haven't answered your question, but I'm simply saying that you're engaging with me on that question is already, in my book, to be doing something called theology.
Why does it have to be called theology rather than an extension of what one would call natural science, which has taken many unpredictable turns to include, for example, a truly unseen world, a world of atoms, which we will never see, and then a world of subatomic particles, field forces and so forth, and indeed degrees of uncertainty, which seem to be mathematically describable. Those themselves are opening up all sorts of possibilities within the sphere of natural science, which doesn't seem to require something beyond as an explanation.
Yes. I'm not sure that it does have to be called theology, and I wouldn't bother about names there, but there is a reason, it seems to me, why it can't just be an extension of natural science. It seems to me that there is all the difference in the world between a question concerning how things are and a question concerning that things are, a question which has to do with the fact that things are, if you see what I mean. Because if you are, as it were, setting that things are against a background of nothingness, then one's beginning to entertain questions about creation. And the classical theistic doctrine of creation is that creation is ex nihilo, out of nothing. Now, it's a curious expression, as Thomas Aquinas pointed out, that nothing isn't a funny kind of something, of any kind. As he said, there isn't a kind of thing that the name nothing names. I mean, there are philosophers who go about as if it did, but Thomas Aquinas was absolutely clear about it. He says, look, it's a very odd sort of making that you're talking about here, because the negation negates the out of. It's a making, but there's no out of going on here.
Yes, but you see, one of the things that always worries me about these fathers and these theologians.
I mention them, by the way, so as to prove that I'm not a one-off, because I mean this is classical theism.
No, I know it's been going on a long time, this sort of stuff, but it always seems to me to be rather similar to the rather brilliant piece of improvisation that my friend John Bird did when he played the Frog Footman in my production of Alice in Wonderland, and he improvised rather brilliantly suddenly in the carol mode when Alice is thundering on the door of the Peppercook's kitchen and she can't get in, and he says to you, I'll tell you what I'll do for you. And then she looks at him questioningly, and he says, I'll tell you what I'll do for you. Nothing. Would that be any good for you? He said, I can't do it straight away because I've got all these things keep propping up. So, and then he said brilliantly, and in a very Thomistic way, he said, if I was to do nothing for you, I'd have to find the time, see, when I could squeeze it in. Now, there is a beautiful intelligibility about that joke. But the reason why it's a joke is that we know that he's using nothing as if it were something about which we can talk. But then I can't get my mind around the notion of this omnipotent creator existing in this nothingness, who then creates something out of the nothingness, or brings something about, leaving the question of why is there a God at all?
Well, I acknowledge the force of your bemusement about that, and of course so do the theologians, who say that it couldn't be the case that the God in question was a sort of thing. I mean, the classical theologians say, well, God is not any kind of thing, because if God were a kind of thing, God would just be one of the other kinds of things that there are, only a rather different one. So we're not talking about something that's on the map of creation. We're talking about something which is off the map of creation, which is why what we're talking, how we're talking now, is a kind of bamboozling nonsense, if you like. That's, by the way, called negative theology. That is to say, knowing that you don't know what you're talking about at this stage. And I think that's really what theology is about. It's the sense that on the other side of our language is something which sustains it, which can't be contained within it. And I think this is what Wittgenstein was after at the end of the Tractatus, when he said, well, what underlies how we say things cannot itself be said. Yes. And that's what we call God.